The cold in the high Colorado territory had a different bite. It was November, and the wind coming off the high peaks near Stillwater Ridge carried the promise of teeth. Eli Carson felt it in the scar on his neck, a tight, pale line that pulled at his skin when the air turned. He worked unnoticed, a ghost in broad daylight, on the edge of the Ridge Rock Cattle Company. His days were a rhythm of mending fences, the wire biting into his worn leather gloves, and checking the herd, his horse moving with the same quiet deliberation as its rider. Eli was a tall man, but he had a way of shrinking himself, of folding into the landscape. He was just a ranch hand, another drifter who had washed up in the high country, and that was how the town of Stillwater Ridge intended to keep him. The other hands on the ranch gave him a wide berth. They were men of loud words and easy laughter, men who spent their pay on whiskey and women at the Red Dog Saloon. Eli did neither. He spoke only when a question required an answer, and his answers were short, clipped things, like stones dropped in a well. He never drank, and he carried that scar. Gossip in a small town is its own form of currency, and Eli Carson was a mystery that Stillwater Ridge could not solve. "It ain't natural, a man so quiet," murmured Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife at the Mercantile, as she measured out flour for a customer. "He comes in, gives his list, and just stands, like a shadow. Gives me a chill." Jed Harris, who ran the smithy, spat a stream of tobacco onto the boardwalk. "It's that mark on his neck. That's a rope burn. Or I'm a Dutchman. Man's an ex-con, I'd wager. Or a deserter. No decent man is that quiet. Heard he was at the saloon last month when Tom Brolin got cut," another man added, leaning against a barrel. "Brolin was bleeding out, and they said Carson just stood by the door. Didn't move a muscle. Cowardice, I call it." No one considered that Eli had been the one to fetch the doctor. His horse lathered and breathing smoke in the cold. He had simply handed the reins to the stable boy and faded back into the night before anyone could thank him. He was a puzzle they had no interest in solving. It was easier to label him a coward or a convict and be done with him. Into this brittle, high-altitude world came Margaret Bell, the stagecoach from Denver, caked in mud and road dust, arrived with a jolt and the scream of its brake blocks. The town, used to the quiet rhythm of its own existence, paused to watch. The door swung open, and out spilled a torrent of life. 10 children, ages ranging from 6 to perhaps 12, blinking in the thin, bright light. "Line up, children, 2 by 2. Abraham, you will hold Sarah's hand. Thomas, please stop kicking the dust onto Mr. Petty's trousers." The voice was clear and firm, but carried a note of exhaustion that cut through the mountain air. Margaret Maggie Bell stepped down last. She was not what the town expected of a schoolteacher. She was young, perhaps only 5 and 20, but she dressed in the somber, practical wool of a widow. And her face, though fine-boned, was guarded. Her eyes, a deep, troubled blue, missed nothing. She looked like a woman who had seen too much and was determined to see no more. She was leading a traveling winter class trip, a geological expedition for her small Denver school, meant to see the hot springs and the new railroad lines before the deep snows set in. Now they were in Stillwater Ridge for 2 nights, waiting to join a larger caravan of traders and families heading west over the pass. Their paths crossed at the livery stable, a place of dust motes and the warm smell of hay and horseflesh. Eli was there on ranch business, picking up a new set of horseshoes from Silas Croft. The livery owner? He was in the shadows of a backstall, calming a spooked mare, his voice a low rumble that the horse seemed to understand. Maggie entered, herding her 2 most curious boys. Who had wandered in? "Mr. Croft? I am Mrs. Bell. I am here to confirm our passage on the caravan. The stage line in Denver assured me." Silas, a man who believed volume equaled importance, boomed. Yes, ma'am. The wagons are set. You and the young'uns will be in the covered coach, right behind the main freight." It was then she saw him. Eli stepped from the shadows, his hand steady on the mare's flank. He was all angles and worn denim, his hat pulled low. He did not look at her. He just existed, a silent, solid presence in the corner. One of the boys, Thomas, the one with the restless feet, pointed. "Who's he?" "Hush, Thomas. That's rude." Maggie's tone was automatic. She gave Eli a polite, dismissive nod, the kind one gives to a piece of furniture that happens to be breathing. Eli, in turn, merely touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so small it was almost invisible. Maggie turned back to Silas. "The weather, they say a storm is forecast. Is it wise to be traveling into the mountains?" Silas laughed, a hearty, dismissive sound. "Ma'am, we get forecasts for storms every other day. This time of year, the sky threatens. But it don't bite. Not for a while yet. The almanac says we're clear for another 2 weeks. These high country storms. We can smell 'em coming a mile off." From the shadows, Eli spoke. His voice was rough, like dry leaves scraping stone. "The wind's from the north." Silas and Maggie both turned. Eli was still focused on the horse, but his body was tense. "It's always from the north." "Eli," Silas said, annoyed at the interruption. "No," Eli said. "It's from the high north. The quiet's wrong. The air smells like iron." Maggie looked at him. His words were strange, poetic, and she dismissed them. He was just a simple ranch hand, as Silas had called him when she first entered. A bit slow, perhaps, but as she was turning away, her bootlace, which had come loose on the boardwalk, caught on a stray piece of straw. She stumbled, a small, undignified hop. Before she could catch herself, Eli was there. He had moved without a sound. He did not touch her. He simply put his hand on a nearby post, blocking her fall, his body acting as a barrier. He was close enough for her to smell the clean, cold scent of him, of pine soap and leather. He looked at her boot. Then he looked at her face. His eyes were a startling, clear gray, like water under ice. They held no judgment, only a quiet, unnerving attentiveness. "Thank you," Maggie said, her face flushing. She was a widow. She was a teacher. She was not used to being this close to a man, especially not one who looked like he'd been carved from the mountain itself. Eli just nodded, that same small, economical movement. He stepped back into the shadows, his presence vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Maggie gathered her boys, her dignity ruffled. A simple man, she thought, repeating Silas's words to herself. But as she left, she could not shake the feeling of those gray eyes. He was not simple. He was watchful. That night, the air in Stillwater Ridge grew heavy and still. The stars seemed impossibly bright, brittle points of light in a black sky. In the Red Dog Saloon, the talk was loud. The forecast from the Stillwater Gazette was tacked to the wall, promising continued seasonal cold with clear skies. "Another false alarm," boomed Jed Harris, slamming his glass on the bar. "We'll be hunting elk in sunshine come tomorrow?" The town went to sleep believing it. But Eli Carson did not sleep. He stood outside the bunkhouse, staring west. The ranch hands snored inside, but Eli was listening to the high peaks. The silence was too loud. The iron smell he'd mentioned was stronger now, a metallic tang on his tongue. He walked to the livery. Silas was closing up, lantern in hand. "You're out late. Carson, that caravan's leaving tomorrow," Eli stated. It was not a question. 8 sharp. Got the school teacher and her brood, 2 families from Missouri, and the traders from Black Hawk, 41 souls in all. Eli looked past Silas, into the barn where the animals were stabled. "You should bank the north wall with hay bales, all the way to the eaves." Silas bristled. "That's a full night's work. What for? And bring the high pasture horses down. All of them. Eli, you're just a ranch hand. You ain't the foreman, and you ain't God. The weather's fine." Eli stepped closer, moving into the small circle of lantern light. His face was grim. The scar on his neck was stark in the yellow glow. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice low, "I saw a storm take 6 men in 20 minutes. The air felt just like this. That stagecoach, the yellow one, put extra oilcloths in it, and blankets, wool. That's extra cost. And Mrs. Belle didn't—" "I'll pay the cost," Eli said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few worn coins. "Do it, Silas, and double the feed for your own animals. They'll need it." There was something in his voice, a cold certainty that cut through Silas's bluster. It was not a request. Silas looked at the coins, then at the hard set of Eli's jaw, grumbling about spooked drifters. He took the money. "Fine, blankets, but you're wrong about the wall." Eli did not argue. He just turned and walked back toward the ranch, a dark shape against the false, starry calm. The storm did not wait for the almanac's permission. It did not arrive 2 days later. It arrived 2 days early. At 6 in the morning, the sky was a pale, sickly gray. By 7, the caravan was assembling. Maggie, her face pinched with a worry she couldn't name, counted her 10 students, their faces bright with the adventure of it all. "Stay together. Do not wander." She saw Silas stow the extra wool blankets Eli had paid for. "Oh," she said, surprised. "That's very kind." "Just a precaution, ma'am," Silas mumbled, avoiding her eyes. At 8 o'clock, the wagon master cracked his whip. The heavy freight wagons groaned. The stagecoach, with Maggie and the children, lurched forward. Behind them, the 2 Conestoga wagons carrying the families and the string of pack mules fell into line. Eli Carson was on a ridge overlooking the town, ostensibly checking a fence line. He sat his horse, still as stone, and watched the caravan move. He watched the bright yellow coach, a tiny speck of color, begin its slow climb toward the mountain pass. He watched until it disappeared into the shadow of the gorge. At 9:30, the world ended. It did not start with a gentle flake. It started with the wind. The wind came first, a low, howling scream from the high north, the sound of a giant tearing the sky in half. It struck Stillwater Ridge like a physical blow, rattling windows and tearing shingles from the mercantile roof. And with the wind came the snow. It was not snow. It was a solid, white wall moving at 60 miles an hour. "A blizzard!" someone shouted in the street, but the word was stolen by the wind. In 1 hour, the temperature dropped 30 degrees. The sun was gone. The sky was gone. There was only the whiteout, a churning, blinding chaos that buried the world. In the ranch bunkhouse, the card game had scattered. The men were staring out the window, their faces pale. "My God!" The foreman, Davis, whispered. "They're in the pass." Eli Carson was already moving. He had been standing by the door, waiting, as if for a signal only he could hear. He did not go to the foreman. He did not ask permission. He walked with a terrible, focused calm to the tack shed. He saddled his Mustang Cross, the toughest horse on the ranch. From his own small footlocker, he took his gear. It was not much, but it was specific. A heavy oilcloth bedroll, a coil of good rope, not the cheap hemp the ranch used, a hatchet, its edge honed razor sharp. He went to the mess hall and took a canvas sack, filling it with a slab of dried beef, a bag of hardtack, and the last of the coffee. He was strapping the bedroll to his saddle when Davis ran out, his face wrapped in a scarf. Carson! Carson! What in the blue blazes do you think you're doing?" Davis shouted over the roar of the wind. "You can't ride in this. That's suicide." Eli finished a knot. He pulled his hat down hard. He did not look at the foreman. He just swung up into the saddle. "Where are you going, man? There's nothing out there but death." Eli Carson looked at Davis. His gray eyes were flat, terrifying, alive with a purpose the foreman could not comprehend. He leaned into the wind, his voice cutting through the noise. "The children!" It was the most the man had ever heard him say. He turned the horse, a dark shape against the impossible white. He did not urge it. He simply let it find its footing. And together, man and beast, they walked into the wall of the storm, vanishing from sight before they had gone 20 yards. For 6 hours, the storm was a physical assault. The wind did not howl. It screamed. A high-pitched, incessant shriek that clawed at the canvas covers of the wagons and drove slivers of ice into the eyes of the drivers. The caravan, 41 souls moving at a crawl, was no longer a procession. It was a panicked, scattered huddle of blind animals and terrified people. "We cannot go on," The wagon master, a broad man named Hatcher, bellowed into the white void. His words were snatched away, his face a mask of frozen beard and panic. "The pass is blind! We are lost!" The lead mules, their long ears flattened, refused to move. They stood shivering, their coats already caked in ice. The big freight wagons had stopped. Behind them, the yellow stagecoach, carrying Maggie Bell and her 10 pupils, was a lonely speck of color in a world that had lost all color. "We must find shelter," Maggie shouted from the coach window, her voice thin with fear. The children were silent. Their bright adventure turned to a nightmare. Their small faces were white, their eyes huge and dark. "There is no shelter," Hatcher roared back, gesturing at the white wall of the gorge. "We are in the throat of the mountain. We are trapped." It was then that one of the Missouri men, Gabe Tilson, pointed a mittened hand. "There, by the ridge, something dark." It was barely a shape, a shadow against the swirling white. The ruins of a cabin burned down to its stone chimney and foundation years ago. It was set deep in a narrow cut in the gorge, a natural wind tunnel. It was a death trap. But it was the only thing there was. "To the cabin," Hatcher commanded. "Unhitch the mules. Get the people to the rocks." The next hour was chaos. Men fought with frozen ropes and screaming, terrified horses. They half dragged, half carried the women and children from the wagons to the meager shelter of the burned-out foundation. The wind in the narrow gorge was worse, a focused, violent river of air that stole their breath and tore at their clothes. They huddled behind the low stone walls, a miserable, freezing mass of humanity. The animals were left to their fate. By nightfall, the first of the horses, their legs frozen, collapsed with a terrible, shuddering sigh. The wind covered them in a white shroud within minutes. Inside the ruin, there was no order. There was only panic. "The food!" a man shouted. It was Wilkes, a trader with hard eyes and a thin mouth, who had been traveling with a stash of his own supplies. "Where's the freight wagon? My supplies." "We have children here," Maggie said, her voice shaking but firm. She had her 10 students, plus the 2 small children of the Tilsons and the baby of the youngest couple, Sarah and Ben Potter. "We must make a fire. We must see to the children first." They had nothing, a few blankets, the small parcels of food they carried, and the vast, killing cold. They built a pathetic fire in the lee of the stone chimney, using broken bits of furniture from the ruin. It smoked terribly, choking them, but it gave a weak, flickering light. That first night, the storm settled in for the kill. The temperature plummeted to something unmeasurable, a cold that felt like a hot iron on the skin. And death came. It was an old trader, Elias Evans, traveling with the Tilsons. He was quiet, and no one noticed he had stopped shivering. When Gabe Tilson tried to rouse him for a sip of whiskey, the man was rigid. His eyes were open, frozen. A woman, Mrs. Tilson, screamed. The sound was high and thin against the constant moan of the wind. Panic, which had been simmering, now boiled over. The fragile shell of civilization cracked. When the gray, false dawn arrived, it revealed a landscape of despair. 3 more horses were dead. The snow was piled in drifts that buried the wagons, and the small, precious stock of shared food was nearly gone. "He's got flour." It was Wilkes. He was standing over Ben Potter, the youngest of the Missouri men, who was clutching a small canvas sack. "It's for my wife," Ben stammered, his face pale. "For Sarah. The baby needs her strength." "We all need strength," Wilkes snarled. "Give it here, boy. We'll divide it proper." "No!" Ben clutched the sack. Wilkes drew a long skinning knife from his belt. "I said, give it here." Hatcher, the wagon master, stood by, his face gray. He did nothing. He had lost control. "Please," Maggie cried, moving in front of the children. "Mr. Wilkes, we are not savages." "We are, ma'am," Wilkes said, his eyes glittering. "We just ain't admitted it till now." He lunged for the sack. Ben Potter raised his arm, and Wilkes brought the knife up, ready to slash. "Stop!" The word was not shouted. It was spoken, low and cold, and it cut through the wind and the panic. A figure stood at the edge of the ruin. He was coated in ice, more a part of the storm than a man. He looked like a snow-covered ghost, his hat and shoulders thick with frost. It was Eli Carson. Wilkes froze, his knife in the air. "Who the hell are you?" Eli did not answer. He moved. His movements were not fast, but they were economical, without a single wasted motion. He stepped past Maggie, grabbed Wilkes's knife wrist with his left hand, and twisted. It was a precise, brutal movement. The sound of bone grating was sickeningly loud. Wilkes screamed, and the knife clattered to the frozen ground. Eli kicked it away into a snowdrift. He did not release the man's wrist. He held him, his gray eyes flat and devoid of emotion. "We don't," Eli said, his voice a raw whisper. "Do that." He shoved Wilkes back. The traitor fell, clutching his arm, his face a mask of astonished pain. Everyone stared. This was not the quiet, simple-minded ranch hand from Stillwater Ridge. This was someone else. His calm, hard-earned authority filled the void left by Hatcher's collapse. Eli's gaze swept over the scene, taking it all in with a terrifying speed. The dead man, Evans, half covered in snow, the whimpering children, the dying fire, the useless, frozen horses. His eyes, red-rimmed from the wind, finally settled on Maggie. "How long?" he asked. Maggie, trembling, found her voice. "Since yesterday morning, the storm. It came on so fast. That man, Mr. Evans, he froze in the night. The baby is sick." Eli nodded, his face grim. He turned to the huddled, terrified group. "My name is Eli Carson. I'm from the Ridge Rock. You are in a wind tunnel. You will all be dead by tonight if you stay here." "The wagons are buried," Hatcher protested, his authority trying to reassert itself. "We have no shelter." "You have wagons," Eli said. He pointed to the half-buried freight wagon. "That is your shelter." He looked at Gabe Tilson and another man. You're strong. Get the axes from the stagecoach boot. Break apart the Conestoga wagon, the frame, the wheels. We need the wood. But that's Mr. Petty's wagon. Mr. Petty is going to be dead," Eli said, his voice sharp as ice. "And so will his wagon. We need planks and canvas." He turned to Hatcher. "Get the rest of the men. We are going to tear the sideboards off that freight wagon. All of them." "Tear it apart?" Hatcher was aghast. "That's a new wagon." Eli took 2 steps and stood inches from the wagon master. He was not as broad as Hatcher, but he seemed to be made of something far denser. "The wagon," he said, "or your people. Choose." He did not wait for an answer. He pulled his own hatchet from his belt and walked to the nearest wagon. The first blow of the steel biting into the frozen oak was a declaration. For the next 5 hours, Eli Carson worked them. He was a force of nature, a silent, relentless engine. He had the men tear apart one of the useless Conestoga wagons. Using the frame for fuel and the heavy canvas cover for a roof, he made them use the remaining freight wagon, still heavy with goods, as the main wall, against the stone gorge. Using the wagon as a windbreak, he directed the construction of a long, low lean-to. He had them rip the padded seats from the stagecoach to line the floor for the children. He was everywhere, showing them how to tie knots that held, how to brace the canvas roof with wagon spokes so the snow would not collapse it, how to build a fire pit that drew the smoke out of the shelter, not into it. He organized the survivors with a cold, impersonal efficiency. The children and the sick, in the back, against the wagon wall. "Mrs. Tilson, you will watch them." He pointed at Maggie. "Mrs. Bell, you will keep the children awake. Make them move. If they sleep now, they will not wake up." Maggie bristled. Her pride, her education, her standing as a teacher, chafed at being ordered by this ranch hand. He was direct. He was earthy. He smelled of horse and snow and something feral. "I know how to care for my pupils, Mr. Carson," she said, her voice tight. Eli paused, his face close to hers. The frost was melting on his beard. Do you know that young Thomas's fingers are black? Do you know that Sarah's lips are blue? Rub their hands, rub their feet. Sing to them, Yell at them. I do not care, but do not let them sleep. His directness shamed her. He was right. She had been so consumed by her own fear. She had been reacting, not leading. She looked at her 10 students, huddled together, and a fierce, protective anger washed over her. She nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin. She went to the children. "All right," she said, her voice finding its old, firm, schoolteacher tone. "Everyone, we are going to play a game. It's called Keep Mrs. Bell Awake. We must all sing, and we will start with Oh, Susanna. Loudly, now!" She became his reluctant supporter, his lieutenant in this war against the cold. She saw the logic in his every move, even as she resented his unyielding authority. As the shelter took shape, the tension among the survivors only grew. The second day bled into the second night. The cold did not relent. The children cried from hunger, a thin, weak wailing that frayed the nerves of the adults. And then, a new, more terrible silence fell. The baby, the potter's little boy, had been sick since the journey began. The cold, the lack of food, the smoky air, it was too much. Sarah Potter, the young mother, had been rocking him, her own face vacant with exhaustion. In the early hours of the third morning, the baby's whimpering stopped. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with a slow dawning horror. "Ben," she whispered. "Ben, he's cold." The death of a child, after the death of the old man, broke something in the camp. The grief was a tangible, heavy thing, but grief quickly curdled into anger. This is his fault. It was Wilkes, his arm in a crude sling. He was pointing at Eli, who was rationing out a thin, hot gruel made of melted snow and the last handful of flour. "He's leading us. Leading us to what? He's just a ranch hand, a drifter." "What does he know?" "He saved us from the wind," Gabe Tilson said, though his voice was weak. "He's got us trapped here." Wilkes shot back. "He's hoarding his own food. I saw that sack he brought, that dried meat. He's keeping it for himself while our children starve." "That meat is for the sickest," Eli said, his voice flat. He didn't even look at Wilkes. "And the children. When there is nothing else. Who made you king?" another man shouted. "We should have stayed in the ruin." "You would be dead," Eli said simply. The men resented him. They were merchants, teamsters, farmers. They were not used to taking orders, and certainly not from a quiet, scarred drifter who refused to even look them in the eye when he spoke. That night, the tension was a wire-pulled taut. Maggie, her heart aching for the Potters, her soul weary, found Eli by the fire. He was sitting at the mouth of the shelter, as he had for 2 nights, a human door against the storm. "They are going to turn on you," she said quietly. He did not turn. He poked the fire with a wagon spoke. "Let them." "Is it true?" she pressed, her frustration and fear making her cruel. "Are you hoarding food? What are you hiding, Mr. Carson? Everyone in Stillwater says you're hiding something. A coward, they say, or a convict. You have the air of a man who is running. What are you running from?" He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the wind and the quiet, terrible weeping of Sarah Potter. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean in to hear it. "I am—" She was taken aback. "What?" He turned his head. His face was gaunt, the skin pulled tight over his bones. His gray eyes, red from smoke and wind, met hers. "I am running. I ran from the war. I ran from the men I served with. I ran from an order that would have killed 50 men for nothing but a man's pride." He looked at the huddled shape sleeping behind them. "I've been running for 10 years. Mrs. Bell, from one ranch to the next, never staying long enough for anyone to ask about the scar on my neck." He looked back into the fire. "But I'm not running from this." His confession, so simple and so complete, extinguished her anger. It left her feeling empty and ashamed. Here was a woman who had taught Shakespeare, who could name the constellations, who understood the theory of geology, and she was useless. Here was a man who barely spoke, who was dismissed by everyone, and he was the only thing standing between her children and death. I'm sorry, she whispered. He just nodded, accepting the apology as a fact, not a comfort. Get some sleep. Mrs. Bell, your children will need you tomorrow. She returned to the huddle of pupils, her body aching with cold, but she did not sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind, and she watched him. He sat at the mouth of the shelter, unmoving. The wind drove fine, stinging snow into the lean-to, and it settled on his hat and his broad shoulders. He did not brush it off. He just sat, a dark, solid shape. Solid. She watched the frost begin to cling to his eyelashes, turning them a ghostly white. She watched the ice form in his beard. He did not shiver. He just endured, his eyes on the storm. And as she watched, something in Maggie's heart, a place that had been frozen solid by grief and duty for 3 long years, began to shift. A small, painful crack appeared, and with it came a strange, terrifying warmth. The third day dawned not with light, but with a thickening of the gray. The storm had not broken. It had settled, digging in its claws, entombing them. The wind had lessened its scream to a constant, high-pitched moan that wore on the nerves like a dull blade. Inside the lean-to, the air was a foul, smoky soup of unwashed bodies, fear, and the stench of sickness. But the greatest enemy was no longer the cold. It was the hunger. The small stock of flour and dried meat was gone. The hardtack had been reduced to crumbs, then to dust licked from the bottom of a sack. The children, who had been brave, were now quiet, their face thin and pale, their eyes large and haunting. The weak, constant crying of the first days had faded into a terrible, listless silence. "We must eat." Eli's voice, though raw, was the only one that still carried authority. He looked at Maggie, at the 10 small faces huddled under the blankets. "We must drink." The fire was their only source of water. Eli organized the children. It was a cruel necessity, but he knew they would die faster from despair than from the cold. He needed them to move, to have a purpose. "Thomas," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He pointed to the largest of the boys. "You are in charge of the water. You and Abraham, take this tin." He gave them a dented cup from his own saddlebag. "Fill it with clean snow. Not the yellow, not the gray, the white. Bring it here. We will melt it. That is your job. It is the most important job. Water is life." The boys, who had been staring at nothing, looked up. A job. They nodded, their expressions solemn. They crawled from the shelter, the first time they had moved for a purpose in a day. He turned to the older girls, Alice and Sarah. "You will help Mrs. Bell." Then he took his hatchet and crawled out of the low opening. Maggie watched him, her heart a tight, cold knot. He went to the small, wind-battered pines that clung to the gorge wall, the ones barely visible through the swirling snow. He returned an hour later, his beard thick with ice. He carried strips of bark. The adults stared at him. Wilkes, his face dark with resentment, muttered, "He's gone mad. He's bringing us firewood we can't burn." Eli ignored him. He sat by the fire and, with his knife, began to carefully peel the rough outer bark away, revealing a moist, pale inner layer. He sliced this inner bark into thin, almost translucent slivers. "This is pine cambium," he said to the children, as if he were in a classroom. His voice was steady, calm. "The tree's life. It is not much. It is not bread, but it is food. It will keep the emptiness from sickness." He held out a sliver to young Thomas. The boy looked at it, then at Maggie. Maggie, her own stomach clenching with a hunger that was like a living thing, nodded. "Do as he says. Thomas, eat." The boy put the sliver in his mouth and chewed. His face was grim, but he swallowed, one by one. Eli fed the children, then he gave the rest to the mothers, to Sarah Potter, whose eyes were still vacant, and to Mrs. Tilson. He saved none for himself. "It tastes like a tree," whispered one of the small girls. "It tastes like one more day," Eli said, his voice flat. That night, the wind rose again, a furious, clawing beast. It tore at the canvas roof. A freezing, stinging cloud of snow burst into the shelter, extinguishing the fire and plunging them into darkness and chaos. The children screamed. Men shouted curses. "The rope is broken!" Hatcher yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "It's tearing loose! We'll be buried!" "Quiet!" Eli's command cut through the terror. "Get the fire lit! Tilson, light a brand! Now!" In the frantic, sputtering light of a burning stick, Maggie saw Eli moving. He was pulling a length of rope from his own saddle gear. The canvas was flapping like a broken wing, the entire shelter groaning, threatening to collapse. "I cannot hold it!" Hatcher shrieked. Eli pushed him aside. He was outside, in the full force of the storm, bareheaded, his hair plastered to his skull by the snow. He was working on the main anchor rope, the one tied to an outcrop of rock. His hands were bare, moving with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. Maggie crept closer to the opening, shielding her eyes. He was not just tying a knot, he was weaving the rope, his fingers pulling, twisting, locking loops into place. It was not a rancher's simple hitch. It was complex, secure, and finished in seconds. He moved to the other anchor point, securing it with a different, equally strange knot. The flapping stopped. The canvas held. The shelter was secure. Eli fell back inside, his body covered in snow, his hands bleeding from the cold and the rope. He sat by the fire, saying nothing, his head bowed. Maggie stared at him. She was the daughter of a university man. She knew books, she knew history. She had seen drawings in her father's study. Those knots, they were not random. They were specific. She had seen them in a book about the war, about cavalry maneuvers. They were the knots of a soldier, of a man trained to secure artillery and equipment in a gale. She looked at the scar on his neck, and, for the first time, she did not see a coward's mark. She saw something else, and the suspicion that had been a spark was now a cold, clear certainty. He was not just a ranch hand. He was a lie. The hunger and the close quarters were working on the men like poison. The death of the baby, the freezing of Elias Evans. It had terrified them. But Eli's competence, his quiet control, terrified them more. It was a judgment on their own weakness. Wilkes was the center of the poison. His arm, which Eli had twisted, was useless, and his pride was a festering wound. He had watched Eli give the last of the dried meat to the children. He had watched him portion the pine bark, and he had watched Maggie watching Eli. The breaking point came on the 5th day. There was nothing left. The pine bark was gone. The men were too weak to hunt, even if there had been anything to hunt. Eli, his face a gray mask of exhaustion, was melting snow for the children. "So that's it," Wilkes' voice rasped, scraping the air. He was standing, swaying on his feet. In his good hand, he held his skinning knife. "What's it, Wilkes?" Eli didn't look up from the fire. "That's the plan. You feed us tree bark, you let us get weak, and then you leave." Eli's head came up slowly. "No one is leaving." "Liar," Wilkes spat. "You're a drifter, a coward. You ran here, you'll run from here. You're just waiting for us to get weak enough that you can take that horse of yours and go, and you'll take her with you." He jabbed the knife toward Maggie. Maggie flinched. "Mr. Wilkes, you are sick. You are not thinking." "I'm thinking clearer than I ever have," he shouted, his voice cracking. "He's got food. I know he does. That little sack he keeps by his side. He's been saving it for himself while our children starve." "That sack is empty," Eli said, his voice deadly quiet. He stood up. He was taller than Wilkes, but he was thinner, worn down. "Let's see," Wilkes snarled, and he lunged. It was not a fight. It was a pathetic, desperate attack. Wilkes was clumsy, weakened by hunger, but he had a knife. Eli moved, not like a man, but like an animal. He didn't try to block the knife. He moved inside the attack, wrapping his body around Wilkes, trying to control the knife hand. They crashed against the wall of the wagon, grunting, their breaths smoking in the cold. "Stop them! Misses!" Tilson screamed. Hatcher and Gabe Tilson, the other men, just watched. They were frozen by fear, or perhaps by a secret, ugly hope. Wilkes was screaming, wordless sounds of rage. He brought the knife up, trying to drive it into Eli's belly. Eli caught the man's wrist with his left hand. His right hand was balled into a fist, but he wasn't punching. He was just holding on. They were on the ground, rolling in the filthy snow and ash. Maggie saw it, the flash of steel, the dark stain. She did not think. The educated, widowed schoolteacher vanished. She grabbed the heaviest piece of firewood from the pile, a thick, half-frozen branch of oak. She stepped forward and brought it down with all her strength on Wilkes's forearm. There was a wet, cracking sound. The knife flew from his numb fingers. Wilkes howled, a sound of pure agony, and collapsed, clutching his arm, which was now broken in 2 places. The shelter was silent. The only sound was Wilkes's gasping sobs and the hiss of the fire. Eli was on his knees. He looked at Maggie. His face was unreadable. He looked down at his own hand, the one he had used to block the worst of the thrust. It was sliced open, a deep, ragged gash from the heel of his palm to the base of his forefinger. Blood, dark and thick, was not dripping. It was pouring, staining the snow black. He looked at it, his expression one of dim surprise. Then he calmly clenched his fist, as if to stop the bleeding, and his eyes rolled back. He slumped forward, unconscious, into the bloody snow. That night, the camp was a graveyard. Wilkes was delirious with pain, his arm a grotesque shape. The other men, shamed into action by Maggie, had bound him and left him to moan. Eli was in his own corner. He had woken, but the bleeding had been terrible. Maggie had torn a strip from her own petticoat, the last clean cloth she possessed, and bound it tightly. But it was not enough. Now, hours later, the children were asleep. The other adults were huddled in a fearful, silent mass. Maggie went to Eli. He was sitting up against the wagon wheel, his face pale as chalk in the flickering firelight. He was shivering. "Let me see it," she said. Her voice was not her own. It was hard, and it shook. "It's fine," he whispered, his voice slurred. "You're a terrible liar, Mr. Carson." She brought the small tin box from the stagecoach, her necessities box. It held a small pair of scissors, a needle, thread, and a flask of whiskey her father had given her for medicinal purposes. She sat on the frozen ground in front of him, so close their knees were touching. She looked at his hand. The rag was soaked through, and the blood was frozen stiff around it. "This will hurt," she said. She braced herself and pulled the frozen cloth away. He did not make a sound, but his whole body went rigid. The wound was terrifying. It was deep, cut to the bone, and filled with the filth of the floor. "Hold this," she said, and she unstopped the whiskey flask. She poured a small amount into the tin cup. Then she took a long, shuddering breath and poured the rest of all that precious, warming liquid directly into the gash. Eli's body arched off the ground. A single, sharp gasp of air was torn from his throat, but he did not cry out. "It's the only way," Maggie whispered, her own eyes filled with tears. "The only way to stop the rot." She took her needle and thread. She did not know how to sew a man's flesh, but she knew how to sew a straight seam. She took a swig of the whiskey she had saved in the cup, the liquid fire burning her throat, and then she began to stitch. He watched her. His eyes, in the firelight, were dark, deep pools of pain. He watched her face, not her hands. He watched her brow furrow in concentration, her lips pressed into a thin white line. Her hands were trembling, but they were steady. She stitched, her movements small and tight. The silence in the shelter was absolute, broken only by the whimpers of Wilkes and the sharp hiss of the wind. When she was finished, she took the last clean strip of cloth, soaked it in the dregs of the whiskey, and bound his hand. Her fingers were clumsy, but she made the bandage tight. She was done, but she did not move. She was still kneeling, her hands resting on his arm, her head bowed. The tension of the last 5 days, the fear, the hunger, the violence, it all came crashing down on her. A sob broke from her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" His voice was a thread. "You saved my life." "No," she said, looking up, the tears cutting tracks in the grime on her face. I haven't felt anything in 3 years. Not since Antietam." He just watched her, his stillness a basin for her to pour her grief into. "My husband, Arthur," she said, the name tasting like ash. "He died at Antietam. He was a captain, so brave, so full of life. They sent me a letter, just a letter, and a ring, and I just stopped. I built a wall. Mr. Carson, I built it so high, so I would never have to feel that again, that breaking, that emptiness." She touched the rough bandage on his hand, her fingers trembling. "And then I came here, and I watched that baby die, and I watched you, and I'm so afraid to feel this fear for you. It hurts. It hurts as much as the hunger. I don't want to feel it. I cannot lose anyone else." She was weeping openly now, her body shaking. Eli, with his good hand, his left hand, reached up. His movement was slow, painful. He did not touch her face. He just brushed the side of her hair, his fingers rough and calloused. But the touch was incredibly, shockingly gentle. "Margaret," he said, her name, the first time. She looked at him. The firelight was on his face, on the pale scar on his neck. "You ain't," he whispered. "Lost me." The space between them was electric. It was more than the cold, more than the fire. She was leaning in. Or he was, she did not know. The children were asleep. The camp was asleep. She was hidden by the shadows and the blanket she had pulled around them. She kissed him, or he kissed her. It was desperate. It was not a kiss of love. Not yet. It was a kiss of survival. A kiss of two people clinging to the only other living thing in a world of ice. It was cold, and it tasted of whiskey and blood and salt from her tears. It was a promise of life. In the middle of death, they broke apart, both breathing hard, as if they had run a mile. She stared at him, her eyes wide with what she had done. He just looked back, his own eyes burning with a fever that had nothing to do with the storm. She hid her face, pulling the blanket tight, and sat beside him, her shoulder pressed against his. That night, she did not sleep. She watched him. By morning, the fever had taken him. The wound, despite the whiskey, was angry. It was red and streaked with black lines that crept up his arm. He was no longer shivering. He was burning. He was delirious, muttering words she could not understand, words of battle, and horses, and a name, Eliza, over and over. Eli Carson was dying. Maggie looked at the sick man. She looked at the useless, hostile men. She looked at the whimpering children. The line between her duty as a teacher and her terror as a woman was gone. The line between duty and desire. It was gone. There was only the fire, the cold, and the man who was burning alive. She found the small tin of herbs she had seen him use on a horse's cut back at the livery. Sage and yarrow, she thought. She ground them with a rock. She boiled water. She tore the last stitches from her own dress to make a clean poultice. She fought for him. She fought the infection. She fought the cold. She fought the men who stared at him, their eyes hungry, waiting for him to die so they could, perhaps, eat his horse. She sat by his side, her hand on his forehead, and she did not let him go. The 7th day, the day the hope died, the fire was a pile of sullen red eyes in a pit of gray ash. The tiny, precious store of pine cambium was a memory. The hunger was no longer a gnawing pain. It was a cold, hollow emptiness, a detachment from the body, a fog that was settling over their minds. Wilkes was a breathing corpse, his broken arm black with frostbite, his whispers a stream of fevered, hateful nonsense. Mrs. Tilson, her face the color of old parchment, had not spoken in a day. Her husband, Gabe, sat beside her, holding her hand, his own eyes vacant. Hatcher, the wagon master, was a broken man. He sat staring at the canvas wall, rocking back and forth. His authority, his very self, gone. Only two people were truly moving, Maggie and Eli. Maggie's care had pulled Eli back from the brink. The fever had broken, leaving him gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his high cheekbones, his gray eyes sunk deep in bruised sockets. His bandaged hand was a throbbing, agonizing weight, but it was not rotten. He was weak, so weak that standing made the world tilt, but he was alive, and his mind, which had wandered in the fevered dark, was now sharp and cold. The survivors, what was left of them, stared at him. They were a flock of starving, freezing sheep, and he was the one wolf they had. They were waiting for him to save them, or waiting for him to die so they could stop waiting. He pushed himself up against the wagon wheel, the movement sending a white-hot spear of pain up his arm. He took a ragged breath. "Hatcher," he said. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of stones scraping. The wagon master did not look up. "Tilson." Gabe Tilson, his face a mask of grief, slowly turned his head. "We stay here," Eli said, each word an effort. "We are dead. All of us. We will be dead in 2 days. The children first." This was a truth no one had dared speak. Maggie, who was giving young Sarah a sip of lukewarm, smoky water, closed her eyes. "There is no hair to leave to," Tilson whispered. "There is only this hole and the storm." Eli stared at the canvas flap, at the world of white beyond it. "The storm has stopped. The wind has turned. It's been a lull. It won't last. We have today, maybe half of tomorrow." He looked at Tilson, then at Hatcher. "I've been running. It's true. What misses? Belle heard me say." He glanced at Maggie. A quick, stark acknowledgement. "I ran from the war, but I didn't run from a fight." He paused, gathering his strength. This was his last, only coin. "I was a scout for the 5th Cavalry. We were on an expedition into this territory, looking for a lost survey party. We got caught, just like this, in this same gorge. The silence in the shelter was absolute. My commanding officer was a fool. He wanted to push on, over the main ridge. It was suicide. I told him. He called it mutiny. I told him I knew another way, an old Ute trail. The miners used it later, to get to the strikes on the other side. A high trail. It's hard. It's dangerous. But it goes down. It follows the ravine, not the ridge." He coughed, a dry, racking sound. "He didn't listen. He ordered the charge. I refused. I took the horses and went. That's when I got this." He touched the scar on his neck. A grazing shot from one of his own men. "They called me a deserter. Maybe I am. But I am alive. And I know the way out." No one spoke. The hope was so faint, so terrible, that no one dared to touch it. Except Wilkes. From his pile of filthy blankets, his voice, high and thin with fever, sliced the air. A scout? A liar." He was struggling to sit up, his eyes burning with a hateful, mad light. "He's a liar. He's a half-breed drifter." The word hung in the shelter, ugly and heavy. Half-breed. It landed. It explained everything to them. The silence, the gray eyes, the dark hair, the otherness, the reason he was just a ranch hand. He wasn't one of them. He was an outcast, and now he was leading them into a death trap. "He's going to lead us onto the ice and kill us," Wilkes panted. "Steal our food. Steal the women. A savage." Hatcher finally looked up, his eyes narrow. "Is it true, Carson? Are you Indian?" Eli's face was stone. He did not answer. He just held Hatcher's gaze. The fragile bond of survival snapped. The men, Hatcher, Tilson, even Petty, the other Missouri man, they looked at Eli, and they did not see a savior. They saw an enemy. "I ain't following no breed into a blizzard," Petty muttered, his voice thick. "He's probably lost. He'll take us off a cliff." "He'll sacrifice us to his spirits," Hatcher added, his voice low. "That's their way." The group was turning. A desperate, starving animal, ready to tear apart the one thing that was different. It was Maggie who moved. She had been quiet, her face pale. Now, she stood up. She walked to the center of the shelter and stood between Eli and the men. Her hands were clenched, and she was shaking, but not from the cold. "Be silent," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was low, and it carried the sharp, cutting authority of a schoolteacher who has found her limit. Wilkes, Hatcher, Petty. They all looked at her, stunned. "You sit there," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Hatcher. "Broken. You." She nodded at Petty. "Hiding. And you." Her voice dripped with contempt for Wilkes. "A coward who attacks a man who is trying to feed him. You call him names. You question his blood." She turned. "This half-breed drifter is the only man who has done anything. He found us. He stopped you." She glanced at Wilkes. "From murder. He built this shelter. He found us food while you stared at the snow. He used his body to secure the roof that is keeping you alive." Her voice rose, gaining strength. "He has not slept. He has not eaten. He has taken a knife for this group. And you dare question him? Because you are afraid? Because he is not what you expected?" She walked back and stood beside Eli, putting her hand on his good shoulder. It was a declaration. It was a choice, made in front of them all. Their bond, forged in whispers and a desperate kiss, was now a public line drawn in the snow. His past does not matter. His blood does not matter. He is our only chance. I am taking my pupils, and I am following Mr. Carson. Anyone who wishes to live. She stared hard at Hatcher. Will do the same. Anyone who wishes to stay here and listen to the ramblings of a madman can have the fire. She turned to Eli. What do we do? The shift was complete. The authority had passed from the wagon master, from the men, to the two of them. Eli looked at her, and in his eyes, beneath the pain and the exhaustion, was a flicker of something new. Gratitude and wonder. He nodded and turned to the men. We leave before dawn. We will build litters. We will carry the sick. We will all walk. He was the mind. Maggie, Tilson, and the now shamed Hatcher were his hands. For the rest of the day, a new, desperate energy filled the camp. Eli, though he could barely stand, directed them. He had them cannibalize the last of the Conestoga wagon. The sideboards, we need 2, and the canvas, tear it into strips. They built 2 crude sleds, just planks of wood with rope harnesses. They would carry Wilkes, who was now a moaning, infectious burden, and Mrs. Tilson, who was so light she seemed barely there. The children, Eli said to Maggie, we need a rope, a long one, from the mule tack. He made a survival line. Each of the 10 children would have a loop to hold, to keep them together in the dark and the snow. They would be tied, in essence, to Maggie. Eli went to his own horse. The Mustang Cross, tough as its owner, was still on its feet, barely. He had fed it the last of his own hardtack and bark. He had stripped himself. He strapped the few remaining blankets, the single axe, and the small tin pot to the saddle. The exodus began in the gray dark, hours before sunrise. It was the coldest part of the day, a deep, penetrating cold that sucked the life from the world. But the wind was low. They were a procession of ghosts. Eli, his face wrapped in a scarf so only his eyes showed, took the lead, his horse breaking the trail. Behind him came Maggie, the lifeline of children attached to her waist. Her 10 pupils, plus the 2 Tilson children, were a silent, shuffling line. Behind them, Hatcher and Gabe Tilson pulled the 2 litters, the runners grating on the frozen snow. Petty, the last man, walked behind, carrying nothing, his head down. They left the shelter, the smoking fire, and the bodies of Elias Evans and the Potter baby. They walked out of the gorge and onto the high trail. It was not a trail, it was a memory, a thin scratched line on the wind-scoured face of the mountain. Eli moved slowly, his head up, reading the rocks, the bend of the few, battered trees, the drift of the snow. He was reading a map only he could see. The first day on the trail, they lost Petty. He was the last in line. He was a big man, and he was not built for this. He sat down in the snow, just for a moment. He said, when Hatcher came back for him, Petty waved him away. Just tired, he muttered. Let me be. Eli went back. He stood over the man. Get up. Go to hell. Breed. Eli looked at him, then at the sky. He had no strength to fight him, and no time to waste. He took the man's blanket. Then die, he said, and walked away. They did not look back. The second day, as the sun was a pale, useless smear in the sky, Mrs. Tilson died. She died without a sound. Gabe Tilson, pulling her litter, felt the shift in weight. He stopped. He looked at her, her face peaceful, free from the cold. He knelt, kissed her forehead, and cut the ropes, pushing the litter over the side of the ravine. He did not say a word. He just took his place at the front of the children's line, his face a granite mask of grief. The group was smaller now, harder. Eli was a machine. He seemed to draw strength not from food, but from the will to move. He gave his own coat to young Thomas, who was shivering so hard he could not walk. He carried the smallest girl, 6-year-old Sarah, on his back, her small, cold arms wrapped around his neck. When they stopped for a few hours of huddled, fireless rest, he would take the hatchet and go, disappearing, returning an hour later with an armload of firewood, his bad hand bleeding, his face a mask of frost. Maggie watched him, her heart aching. He was killing himself to save them. On the third night of the trail, they made a cold camp. They found a shallow overhang, a scoop in the rock, and built a small, sputtering fire. They had lost Petty. They had lost Mrs. Tilson. The group was down to 36 souls. The children were hollow-eyed, their bodies on the verge of collapsing. Maggie tucked them in, all 12 of them, in a pile of shared blankets. She checked their feet, rubbing them, her hands raw. She had done everything, but they were so weak. She looked at Sarah, the little girl Eli had carried, her face blue-white in the firelight. She looked at Thomas, wearing Eli's coat, his breathing shallow. She had failed. The guilt, held back by a dam of sheer will, broke. She crawled away from the fire, into the deep, frozen dark, until the small group was just a flickering light. She sank to her knees in the snow, and she broke. She did not make a sound. She covered her face with her raw mittens, and her body was racked with silent, agonizing sobs. She had brought them here, to learn about rocks and trees. She, the educated one, the teacher, and she had led them all to their deaths. She felt a presence, not a sound, just a shift in the air. Eli was sitting beside her. He did not speak. He just sat, his good shoulder against hers, his body a solid, living shield against the wind. He pulled her against him, tucking her head under his chin. His bad arm was cradled against his chest, but his good one, his left, was strong. He held her. You haven't failed, he whispered, his voice a rasp against her hair. They are breathing. That is all. That is the only thing that matters. She turned into him, her face against the rough, frozen wool of his shirt. She was not a teacher. He was not a ranch hand. They were just two people, at the end of the world. That night, under a shared, filthy blanket, huddled against the rock for warmth. It happened. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss in the shelter. This was something else. It was slow, desperate, an affirmation, not of passion, but of life. It was more love than lust, a raw, emotionally charged intimacy that ached with all the pain they had endured. He was weak. She was exhausted, but she touched him. Her cold fingers traced the scar on his neck. This, she whispered, is not a mark of shame. He held her face, his thumb moving over her chapped lips. His hand was rough, but his touch was tender. Margaret, he breathed. It was a joining of two people who had nothing left but each other. It was a promise, in the darkness, that they were alive. For this one, stolen moment, every touch was a statement. I am here. You are here. The next morning, they moved on. The intimacy had changed them. It was a quiet, shared knowledge, a new gravity that held them together. The trail was worse. It narrowed, becoming a thin scratched line on the side of a massive ravine. On their right was a sheer rock wall. On their left, a 1,000-foot drop to the frozen river below. They were almost at the end of the gorge, almost to the wide-open slopes that led down to the lowlands. And then the world cracked. It started as a rumble, a sound felt in the feet before it was heard. "Stop!" Eli's voice was sharp. He threw his arm out, stopping Maggie. The horse, sensitive to the change, whinnied and stepped back. High above them, a cornice of snow, weakened by the lull and the sun. "Let go! Against the wall!" he screamed. "Cover your heads! Against the wall!" It was not a huge avalanche. It was a river of snow, ice, and rock. It poured down the side of the mountain. A white, roaring dragon. It did not hit them. It passed 30 yards in front of them, wiping the trail, their only path forward, completely clean. It was over in 20 seconds. They were left in a cloud of ice dust. When it cleared, they saw the trail was gone. In its place was a 50-foot sheer wall of broken, jumbled ice and packed snow, blocking the ravine. They were trapped. The way back was death. The way forward was impossible. "We're done," Hatcher said. He sat in the snow. "We are done." The children began to cry, a thin, hopeless wailing. But Eli was not looking at the men. He was looking up. He was studying the ice ridge, the scar the avalanche had left. He handed his rope, the good cavalry rope, to Gabe Tilson. "Hold this. Do not let go." He looked at Maggie. His gray eyes were on fire. "Keep them back. Do not let them come close." "Eli, no," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "You can't. Your hand." "It's the only way," he said. He took his hatchet. He began to climb. It was an act of pure, impossible will. He used the hatchet, his good hand, and his mangled, bad hand as a claw. He climbed the sheer, unstable face of the avalanche debris. Maggie watched, her heart in her throat. She held her breath. The children were silent, watching the small, dark figure. He was halfway up when a chunk of ice broke free. He slipped. He fell 10 feet, caught by his own hatchet, which was lodged in the ice. He dangled, his body swinging over the abyss, held by one arm. "Eli!" Maggie screamed. The name was torn from her, a raw, terrified sound. He did not look down. They saw him, a tiny figure, slowly, painfully, find a new hold with his feet. He tested it. He pulled his bad hand up, jamming it into a crack. He pulled the hatchet free, and he kept climbing. He reached the top. He was a small, dark speck against the gray sky. He disappeared over the ridge. They waited. "He's gone," Hatcher whispered. "He's dead. He fell." "He is not," Maggie said, her voice a fierce, shaking prayer. "He is not." 1 minute, 5, 10. The silence was a crushing weight. Then, a shower of ice from above. Eli was there, at the top of the ice wall. He was using his hatchet, his body, working his way down, cutting a path. He was creating a series of crude, dangerous steps in the packed ice. He worked for an hour, a high, lonely figure. The only sound, the thud, thud, thud of his hatchet. He finally slid down the last 20 feet, landing in a heap at their feet. He was covered in blood. The sutures on his hand had torn, and his arm was a crimson mess. His face was bleeding from a dozen ice cuts. His entire body was shaking so hard he could not stand. The quakes of a man who had gone far beyond the limits of human endurance. He looked up at Maggie, his eyes a blurry, unfocused gray. "The path," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "It's a path." He had done it. He was half dead, but he had cleared away. He collapsed. Maggie and Tilson rushed forward, dragging him up. He put his good arm over Maggie's shoulder, his weight almost crushing her. He looked at the small, terrified group. We go now, before it freezes harder." And the group, with their scarred, bloody, and frozen leader held upright by the schoolteacher, pushed on. The path down from the ice wall was a new circle of hell. It was a steep, treacherous descent, and every step was a choice to live or to fall. Eli, held upright between Maggie and Gabe Tilson, was a dead weight, his body a puppet with cut strings. He was breathing, but in shallow, rattling gasps, his blood leaving a dark, frozen trail in the snow. The children, seeing his collapse, were gripped by a new, more profound terror. He had been their rock, their impossible, unmovable leader. Now he was as weak as they were. "Keep moving!" Maggie's voice was a raw croak, directed at her pupils, at Hatcher, at the universe. "Hold the rope. Do not look down. Look at the feet of the person in front of you. Keep moving." They moved for hours. The world was a blur of gray rock, white snow, and the red-black of Eli's blood. They were no longer a caravan. They were a ragged, shuffling line of ghosts. And then Gabe Tilson, his voice hoarse, said, "Smoke." It was not smoke. It was the dark shape of a building, a shadow against the unending white. An old mining shack, its roof half collapsed, a chimney pipe jutting from the snow like a broken bone. It was tucked into a grove of pine, halfway down the mountain. It was shelter. The last 100 yards were a desperate, stumbling run. Tilson kicked the snow-packed door open, and they fell inside, one on top of the other, a heap of starving, frozen humanity. It was small, just one room, but it was dry. There was a rusted, pot-bellied stove, a broken table, and 2 crude bunks. It was a palace. Eli was the last one in. Maggie and Tilson dragged him, his legs trailing uselessly. They did not put him with the others. They laid him in the corner, on one of the bunks, as if he were already a body prepared for burial. He was not moving. His skin was the color of ash. His eyes were closed. His bandaged hand, a mass of frozen, bloody rags, was a terrible, dark weight on his chest. Maggie sank to her knees beside him. She was empty. She had nothing left. She had pushed them, carried them, willed them this far, and the man who had shown her how, the man who had climbed the ice, was dying. Get a fire," she whispered. Not to anyone, just to the room. To her surprise, Hatcher, the wagon master, moved. His face was a mask of gray stubble and frozen tears. He looked at Eli, a long, deep look of shame and an awful, dawning understanding. He had been a leader, and he had failed. He had watched this drifter, this half-breed, sacrifice himself. He picked up the hatchet Eli had dropped. I'll get wood," he said, his voice thick. He stumbled out the door. Gabe Tilson, his face a grim mask, began to herd the children to the far wall. "Against the wall, all of you, huddle, give misses, bell room." The survivors had seen it all. They had watched Eli climb. They had watched him bleed. And they had watched Maggie stand by him. The poison of prejudice, the resentment, it was all gone, burned away by the terrible, undeniable truth of his sacrifice. They just stared, their hollow eyes watching Maggie as she began the fight for Eli's life. She took a snow-filled pot and put it on the stove, waiting for Hatcher to bring the wood. She found Eli's saddlebag, the one she had carried. She opened it. There, at the bottom, under the small bag of herbs and the extra ammunition, was a piece of oilcloth. Wrapped inside was a worn, black-covered book of poetry, and an old, heavy, Colt Model 1851 Army pistol. It was clean, oiled, a soldier's weapon. She put the pistol aside, her fingers brushing the cold metal. She took the herbs, the last of the yarrow and sage. When Hatcher returned, the fire was lit. The small stove began to radiate a weak, beautiful warmth. Maggie boiled water. She cut away the frozen, ruined bandages. The wound was a nightmare. The stitches she had sewn were gone, ripped out. It was a raw, open, infected gash. She cleaned it. She worked with a slow, focused intensity, her movements no longer shaking. This was a duty. He was her charge, she did not have a word for it. He was hers to save. She made a poultice of the herbs in hot water, and she packed the wound, binding it with the last clean strips of her underclothing. She did not know if it would be enough. He was so cold. "We need food." Ben Potter, the young husband, said, his voice a dry whisper. He was holding his wife, Sarah, who just stared at the wall. If we don't eat, we won't last the night. Hatcher and Tilson searched the shack. In a small, mouse-chewed crate under the other bunk, they found it. A cache, left by a miner. Years ago, it was not much. A tin of coffee, a half-full bag of beans, and a small, precious sack of jerky. Hard as rock. It was a miracle. Tilson took charge. Mrs. Bell, you'll divide it. For the children first. Maggie, her hands stained, just nodded. She boiled the beans, making a thin, hot soup. She gave each child 3 beans and a spoonful of the broth. She gave them a sliver of jerky to suck on. It was the first real food they had tasted in 8 days. The effect was immediate. A little color returned to their faces. The smallest ones, who had been silent, began to cry. The sound of life returning. She gave a cup to Ben and Sarah Potter. She gave one to Gabe Tilson and one to Hatcher. Then she looked at Wilkes. He was in the corner, shivering, his eyes bright with fever and a terrible, animal cunning. He had watched them find the food. He gets nothing, Tilson said, his voice flat. He's a dead man. We don't waste it. He eats, Maggie said. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. We are not him. She gave him a small portion, which he ate like a wolf, his eyes never leaving the food cache. She made a broth for Eli, but he could not swallow. His body was shutting down. She could only wet his lips with a damp rag. That night, they slept. A true, deep sleep, huddled together by the stove. Maggie sat propped against the wall by Eli's bunk, her hand on his chest, feeling the faint, shallow rise and fall. She must have dozed. She was woken by a sound, a scuffle. The fire was low. In the dim, red light, she saw 2 shapes, Wilkes and Hatcher. Wilkes was on his feet, his good arm holding the sack of jerky. Hatcher was by the door, holding the beans and the coffee. His face was a mask of desperation. We can't, Hatcher was whispering, his voice frantic. They're children. We can't. You want to live? Wilkes hissed. He's dead. He pointed at Eli. She's weak. The rest are half gone. We take this. We can make it. It's only a day's walk, I'd wager. We'll be in Stillwater by tomorrow. They'll die anyway. No, Maggie said. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the shack. The 2 men froze. The children, waking, began to whimper. Put it back, Mr. Hatcher. Mrs. Bell, Hatcher stammered. You don't understand. We're starving. We have to. You, she said, her voice like ice, are a coward. You were a coward in the gorge, and you are a coward now. She was on her feet. She was not the same woman who had left Denver. She was not the same woman who had stumbled into the gorge. She was cold, and she was full of a rage that was as pure and as hard as a diamond. And you, she looked at Wilkes, you are not a man. You are just a greedy, dark hole. You will not take this food. Or what, teacher? Wilkes sneered, his good hand moving toward the knife at his belt. You'll read us a poem? No, Maggie said. She reached into Eli's saddlebag. The sound of her hand closing on the pistol grip was lost, but the click as she pulled back the hammer, cocking the weapon, was the loudest sound in the world. She raised the old Colt Army pistol. It was heavy, but her hand was steady. She held it with both hands, aiming it not at Wilkes, but at Hatcher. Put it down, Mr. Hatcher, she said. Hatcher looked at the big dark bore of the gun. He looked at her face, her eyes, and he saw no fear, no hesitation. He dropped the sack of beans as if it were on fire. He stammered, backing away. Now you, Maggie said, shifting the heavy barrel to Wilkes. Wilkes stared at her. You won't. You ain't got the nerve. My husband died at Antietam, Maggie said, her voice a low, shaking testament. I watched a baby freeze to death. I put my hands inside that man. She pointed at Eli. To stitch him together. Do not. For 1 second. Think you know what I have the nerve to do?" She took a step forward. "Put the jerky back, or I will send you to hell, Mr. Wilkes. I will do it, and I will sleep tonight." Wilkes looked at her. He saw a truth that was colder and harder than the storm. He saw that she meant it, slowly, his hands shaking. He placed the jerky back in the crate. "Sit down," she commanded. "Both of you, against the wall, where I can see you." They scrambled, like whipped dogs, to the far wall. Maggie did not put the pistol down. She sat on the floor, her back to Eli's bunk, the heavy gun resting on her lap, pointing at the room. She was the guardian. She would see them through. The fever broke at dawn. Eli woke with a gasp, as if coming up from underwater. His eyes flew open. They were clear. The fever was gone. "Shh," Maggie whispered. The gun was on the floor beside her. She was exhausted, her face a pale, grimed mask. "Shh, Eli, you're safe." He looked at her. He looked around the shack, at the sleeping children, at the 2 men, Hatcher and Wilkes, watching him with wide, terrified eyes. He looked at the gun by her hand. "You," he whispered. His voice was a dry crackle. "I am fine," she said. "We are fine." She gave him a cup of the thin bean broth. He drank it, his good hand shaking so badly she had to hold the cup for him. He drank, and he looked at her. The silence in the room was beautiful. "You saved me," he said. "We saved each other." She replied. She touched his face, her fingers tracing the gaunt line of his jaw. "Margaret," he said. He needed to tell her. "I ran. I'm a deserter. I'm a—" "Hush," she said, her voice full of a tenderness that broke his heart. "I know what you are. You are a man who climbs ice walls. You are a man who gives his coat to a child. You are the man who came back for us." She leaned close, her forehead touching his. The smell of smoke and sweat and pine and life. "You deserve to live, Eli Carson," she whispered, her voice fierce. "You deserve to stop running. You deserve to be loved. You hear me? You deserve to be loved." He closed his eyes. He did not have the strength to reply, but in his heart, a frozen, locked thing, a small, warm seed, began to grow. The next morning, the food was almost gone. One last, thin meal. The snow had started again. Not a blizzard, but a thick, heavy, spirit-breaking fall. Eli was weak, but his mind was clear. "You have to go," he said. He was sitting up, propped against the wall. "We are not leaving you," Maggie said. "You are," he said. "You and Tilson." He looked at Gabe Tilson. "You are the strongest. You will take Maggie. You will follow the ravine. It's another, I'd say, 10 miles. But it's all downhill. You will hit the lower valley. You will find the railroad line. You'll find Stillwater. Bring them back. I'm staying with you," Maggie said, her voice stubborn. "No," Eli said, his voice hard. "You are leading them. You lead the children out of the gorge. You lead the rescue back. I can't walk, and—" He looked at Hatcher and Wilkes. "They will not move, not without you." He was right. He was their leader, but she was their hope. "I will leave Mr. Tilson the pistol," she said. "No," Eli said. He smiled, a faint, painful crack of his lips. "You keep it. I trust you more." He looked at Hatcher. "Mr. Hatcher, you will keep the fire. You will not let it go out. You will keep the children alive until she returns." Hatcher, a broken, shamed man, just nodded, his eyes on the floor. "Yes, sir." Maggie kissed Eli. It was not a desperate kiss. It was a promise. "I will come back," she said. "I will not. I will not leave you." "I know," he said. She and Gabe Tilson left in the swirling snow. The door closed, and the shack was left in silence. The wait was the hardest part. The first day, Eli slept, the children slept. Hatcher kept the fire, a silent, grim guardian. The second day, the snow stopped, the food was gone. They drank hot water. To keep the children from madness, Eli had them sit by the stove. Mrs. Bell, he said, his voice still weak. She likes poems. Does she teach you poems? Young Thomas nodded. She taught us one, about a raven. Tell it to me, Eli said, and so, in the starving cold shack, the children, one by one, recited the poems and the songs their schoolteacher had taught them. They sang, "Oh, Susanna." They recited Mr. Longfellow. It was a thin, reedy sound of civilization in the middle of the savage white. The third day, no one came. Hope began to curdle. Hatcher sat by the door, staring. The children were silent, too weak to even cry. Eli, his own strength fading, felt the cold creeping back in. He had brought them this far, only to die in sight of the finish line. The fourth morning, the air was clear and lethally cold. The fire was just embers. Hatcher was asleep, or dead, by the door. Eli heard it first, not a sound, a feeling, a crunch. He pulled himself up on one elbow. A crunch, then another, the sound of hooves. "Hatcher," he croaked. "Hatcher, the door!" Hatcher scrambled, fell, and opened the door. The sun on the snow was blinding, and in that light were four dark shapes, men on horses, and at the front, on a big bay horse, wrapped in a man's coat, was Maggie Bell. Behind her were riders from Stillwater Ridge, leading pack mules, steam rising from blankets, and the blessed beautiful smell of coffee and stew. "We found them!" a man shouted. "My God, they're alive!" Maggie fell from the horse, stumbling, running, collapsing through the doorway. She saw the children, pale but alive. She saw Hatcher weeping, and she saw Eli in the corner, his eyes open, watching her. He was barely alive. He was a skeleton, his face a hollow mask, but he was breathing. She crawled to him. "I told you," she choked, her tears freezing on her face. "I told you I would come back." He reached up, his good hand, and touched her face. He had no words. He just looked at her, and that, for now, was enough. Weeks later, the world had color again. Spring had not yet come to Stillwater Ridge, but the iron grip of the White Death had released its hold. The town, which had given up 41 souls for dead, was now forced to reckon with their return. The 36 survivors recovered slowly. They were shadows, gaunt and haunted, but they were alive. The Tilson children were taken in by the blacksmith's wife. Ben and Sarah Potter, who had lost their baby, clung to each other, their grief a silent, shared blanket. Hatcher, the wagon master, had disappeared, taking a horse in the dead of night and riding south, his shame too heavy to bear. Wilkes, his arm and his spirit broken, was under the care of the doctor, awaiting a trial for his actions in the gorge. And the town talked. The story had become a legend in the space of a few weeks. The Stillwater Gazette ran a full page, calling it "The Miracle in the Gorge." The article, penned by a man who had never left the warmth of the town, spoke of divine providence and the indomitable spirit of the pioneers. It mentioned, in passing, the efforts of an unnamed ranch hand who had been with the party, but the survivors knew the truth. They told the truth. And so, the way the town treated Eli Carson changed. He was no longer a ghost, no longer a shadow to be dismissed. He was a complication. He had been taken in by the town doctor, his body a ravaged landscape of infection, starvation, and frostbite. He had nearly lost his hand, but the doctor, pushed by Maggie's unyielding presence, had saved it. It would be a scarred, stiff thing, but it was his when he was finally able to walk, thin as a rail, leaning on a cane. The townspeople of Stillwater Ridge did not know what to do with him. The men who had called him a coward, who had gossiped about the scar on his neck, now fell silent when he passed. They looked away, their faces dark with a shame they could not articulate. Mrs. Gable, from the Mercantile, who had once claimed he gave her a chill, now pressed a small sack of fresh bread into his good hand, her eyes watery. "For your strength, Mr. Carson," she'd mumbled, and hurried away. Others looked at him with a different kind of intensity. Awe. He was the man who had climbed the ice. He was the man who had bled, and walked, and carried them home. He was more than a ranch hand, and this new, sudden respect made him as uncomfortable as their previous scorn. He was staying in a small, clean room above the livery, paid for by the Ridge Rock Cattle Company, whose foreman, Davis, had been the first to shake his hand. His voice thick. We didn't know. Eli, we're proud to have you." Eli just nodded, his gray eyes unreadable, and took the room. He spent his days sitting by the window, watching the snow melt, learning how to use his damaged hand, and waiting. He did not have to wait long. Maggie Bell had not left his side during the worst of his recovery. She had been a constant presence, sleeping on a chair in the doctor's office, reading to him when he was fevered, and fighting for him when the doctor had spoken of amputation. But in the last week, as he regained his strength, she had been busy. She came to him in the late afternoon, when the sun was painting the melting snow in hues of gold and blue. She knocked on his door. "Come in," he said, his voice still rough. She entered, and she brought the spring with her. She was no longer the gaunt, grimed survivor. She had color in her cheeks. She was wearing a simple wool dress, the dark blue of a clear night sky. Her hair was pinned up, but the light from the window caught the red in it. "Maggie," he said. The name was still new, a comfort. "Eli?" She smiled, a small, genuine smile. She was holding a parcel, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "I brought you something." He looked at the parcel, then at her. He said nothing. She sat on the small chair opposite him. "Your boots," she said. They were ruined, cut to pieces. I couldn't save them." She placed the parcel on his lap. He worked the twine with his good hand. His left, he pulled away the paper. They were boots, new, sturdy leather, a deep, rich brown. They were well made, the stitching on the soles even and strong, but it was the side, near the ankle, that he saw. Stitched in thick, dark thread were his initials, E.C. He looked at the stitching, then at her. He touched the letters, his rough finger tracing the E. I stitched them myself," she said, a faint blush rising on her neck. "I learned from my mother. It's not as fine as a cobbler, but the leather is the best I could buy. I sold my father's watch. The one I brought from Denver." He couldn't speak. He just looked at the boots, the evidence of her sacrifice. "I'm staying. Eli," she said quietly. His head came up. "Staying?" "Here, in Stillwater, the town council, after the children returned, after the stories. They are not the same men they were. They feel responsible, ashamed. They have agreed to rebuild the school. They've given me the funds and the land. We are to start construction as soon as the ground thaws." He just watched her, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. "I am going to build it," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "And I am going to teach those children, not just about rocks and numbers, but about what matters, about courage and what it costs." She leaned forward, her hands finding his. She covered his good hand and his scarred, ruined one. She held them both. "Eli," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I do not know how to say this. I am a widow. I am a teacher. I was a practical woman. And then I went into the storm, and I met a man. Her blue eyes were shining, her gaze so direct he could not look away. "I am falling in love with you. Eli Carson. Not the man they whisper about, not the unnamed ranch hand, not the hero, the man who sat in the snow, the man who fed my children, the man who bled, and who held me in the dark. I love you." The words hung in the quiet room. He had survived the storm, the ice, the avalanche, the knife. But this quiet confession, it undid him. He pulled his hands away, his good hand rising to cover his face. A single, shuddering breath escaped him. "You don't," he whispered, his voice thick. You don't know me. You don't know what I am. I know exactly what you are, she said, her voice firm, moving to kneel on the floor in front of him. No. He dropped his hand, his face a mask of old, deep pain. The time for running was over. She had given him her truth. He owed her his... Maggie, you have to know. What Wilkes said, what Hatcher believed. It was true, part of it. He looked at the floor. My mother, she was Ute. A woman, my father. A traitor. Left behind. I grew up in two worlds, and belonged to neither. Too white for the people. Too much else for the town. I have been a half-breed drifter my whole life. He took a ragged breath. I joined the army. I thought I could be something else. A soldier, a man of honor. And I was a good scout. I knew the land. I knew what it was saying. And then, in that gorge, it happened just like I said. His eyes were dark, lost in a memory she could not see. Captain Wells, he was a proud man. A man who saw the world in maps, not in the wind. He ordered us up the ridge. It was a suicidal order. It was not war, it was a tantrum. He was going to send 50 men, good men, to their deaths, for his own pride, because he would not listen to me. So I disobeyed, he whispered. I refused the order. I told him I would not lead the charge. He called me a mutineer. He called me a coward. He drew his pistol. I turned to take the horses, to do something. He fired. He grazed me. He touched the scar on his neck. I just rode. I took the horses and I rode. I ran. I've been running ever since. I'm a deserter. Maggie, I'm a man with no honor. A coward who ran. He was breathing hard, the confession torn from him, leaving him open and raw and waiting for the judgment, waiting for her to see him as he saw himself. She did not speak for a long time. She just looked at him, her face full of a profound, aching tenderness. Then she moved. She rose from her knees, and she sat on the small stool, close, so their knees touched. She reached out, her fingers warm, and she touched the scar on his neck, the mark he had hidden, the mark of his shame. You disobeyed a suicidal order, she said, her voice clear and strong. Yes, you saved yourself. I ran. You lived, she countered, her voice fierce. And because you lived, because you knew that gorge, because you knew what it was to disobey a fool's order, 36 people are alive. My children are alive. She leaned in, her forehead touching his. I am alive. And she kissed him. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the shelter. It was not the aching, desperate intimacy of the trail. It was a kiss of acceptance, of promise. It was the kiss of a woman who had seen all of him, all the scars, all the fear, all the broken parts, and had chosen him. She pulled back, her blue eyes holding his gray ones. You're not just a ranch hand, Eli, she whispered, her hands framing his face. You're not a coward. You're not a deserter. You are the reason I am still breathing. The ground thawed. The spring came to Stillwater Ridge not as a gentle promise, but as a muddy, surging flood of life. The sound of hammers echoed in the town. They stood on a small hill overlooking the main street. The frame of a new building was rising against the bright blue sky. It was long and low, with big windows facing south. Eli stood tall. He was no longer leaning on a cane. He wore the boots Maggie had made for him. His scarred hand rested on the new-cut pine of the frame. His good hand held Maggie's. Below them, in the schoolyard, the children were playing. His children. She called them the survivors, Thomas and Abraham, and young Sarah. They were loud, and they were running, their voices full of the uncomplicated joy of children who have been given back the world. A man was approaching, carrying a long, newly painted board. He set it down, touched his cap to Maggie, and nodded respectfully to Eli. Mrs. Bell, Mr. Carson, it's ready. Thank you, Jed. Maggie said, her voice warm. It's beautiful. Eli looked at the sign. The letters were crisp, black on white. He read the words, Carson Shelter Schoolhouse, in honor of the man who carried 40 souls through the storm. He looked at the words, and for the first time in his life, he did not feel the pull of the horizon. He did not feel the urge to run. Maggie squeezed his hand. He looked at her, at the wind in her hair, at the future in her eyes. He was not a drifter. He was not a shadow. He was home. Thank you so much for listening to our story today. It means the world to us. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please, drop a comment and let us know. And if you enjoyed this story, and you want to hear more tales from the frontier, please be sure to subscribe to From Wild West. We'd be honored if you'd share your thoughts on the story in English. Your feedback helps us bring these histories to life.